Fred Weir is a journalist and political commentator joining us from Moscow. We also have Mike Billington, Executive Intelligence Review, joining us from Leesburg, Virginia. I'd like to welcome to you both. Fred Weir, looking at the progress of these talks, or lack of it, I should say, was pretty evident before they even started, and at this point it seems like they're going to discontinue. What are we looking at now if that were to happen, which it appears that it will? Are we looking at U.S. sanctions, the next step for the U.S. against Russia?
I don't think we should be too swift to declare these talks over and dead. They will continue. They may go to a lower level, to committees and so on. But I think there's an emerging consensus. If you read commentary, I mean really high-level expert commentary from both sides, there are the outlines of compromises, even though the big maximal positions on both sides look irreconcilable. I think they both knew that going in, and they have vented their maximal positions now in those big high-level, high-profile talks. Now I think there will be some, discussion about the details, things that don't require either side to give up on principles, but might just move the ball a little bit. And what we need is a new security architecture in Europe. I think everybody agrees with that, and that the Russia of today is not the Russia of the 1990s, when the present architecture was more or less unilaterally formed. So therefore, belatedly and begrudgingly, I think that the West is coming around to the idea that they're going to have to provide Russia with some satisfaction to its demands. I think we shouldn't give up on our optimism yet.
Okay, so Mike Billington, new security guarantees or arrangements, as Fred Weir indicated, is something that Russia is asking for. During the talks, it seems like NATO did not even look at the proposal that was set forward. At the other end of the spectrum, we're looking at compromises, which again, these talks don't seem to have reached any yet. Are we looking at any to possibly happen, and what can they be in your eyes?
Let me mention that I can barely hear you, but I did hear you. I totally agree with your other guest. I think the declaration that the talks are finished are wrong. It's part of a Western media basically lying about the situation, blaming everything on Russia and so on. But people do recognize, especially in Europe, that the reason the Russians did not strongly challenge the security issue, going back to the earlier spreading of NATO against the wishes of the Russians, is that the Russians were in an economic mess in the 90s and in the first part of the 21st century, and were not as strong militarily. Since 2007, the world knows from Vladimir Putin's speech in Munich in 2007 that the Russians were on the verge of catching up, and have now at this point caught up and perhaps gone beyond the U.S. Western military capacity. They have the strength to challenge this attempt to move NATO forces up to their border. The Russians, of course, do remember when Napoleon and later Hitler brought forces up to their border and what the consequences were, and they will not allow it, and they absolutely should not. I would emphasize what your other guest said, whose name I didn't catch, unfortunately, is that what's needed is a new architecture. The LaRouche organization, the Schiller Institute, fully agree with that. On the other hand, the danger is not gone by a long shot. We have madmen, and I mean madmen, in the U.S. military-industrial complex who need a war, and even though they know they could not win such a war against either Russia or China, you then create the conditions in which the madmen like Admiral Richard, the head of the U.S. Strategic Command, who believes a nuclear war is likely, and others, including Senator Weicker in the U.S. Senate, who has literally called for a first-strike nuclear bombardment of Russia. I agree this is far from likely, but this is the mentality of certain madmen, and therefore, especially since the presidents in the United States do not rule by dictate. As Trump showed when he demanded the U.S. pull out of the Syrian war and other wars, and the military simply ignored him. The same is certainly true now when you have people like Blinken and the Wall Street military-industrial complex basically making the decisions. So this is a crucial moment in which the direct relationships between Putin and Biden are critical.
Sure.
Biden is a troubled president, to put it politely, but nonetheless, he appears to be aware that the danger of nuclear war is great,
Okay.
that he and Putin and the other P5 members did sign the statement saying that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. So we have to act on the basis of that potential while maintaining a warning to the world that
Sure.
the West could indeed be sleepwalking into a thermonuclear war.
Well, the fact, Fred Weir, that Moscow says that it could deploy military hardware to Cuba or Venezuela, do you think that that could mean that there are other variables that could be used that's not related to just NATO, US, and Russia, that perhaps concessions can be made, a give and take, so to speak, on other issues perhaps that the US and NATO don't agree with Russia, in particular the US, that can then come up to what you said was a compromise of some sorts?
Right. Well, they're pulling your leg on that subject, but they're also making a very strong polemical point, which is the United States would freak out at the thought of Cuba or Venezuela joining a Russian or Chinese-led military alliance.
You're saying that's just posturing?
Well, yeah, I think so, but it's not pointless. It is an important argument. There's, the United States is coming in to these talks saying this sort of thing is not done in the 21st century. We have these sovereign states, and their will is paramount, and why they can join any military alliance they want. So the Russians are simply making a rather obvious counter-narrative point. So what if we put troops in Cuba? What would you think? Like, put the shoe on the other foot. That's the level that's on, and it's a perfectly valid argument. I don't think Russian troops will be embarking to either of those countries anytime soon. But yes, this is a big, broad, far-ranging debate that's going on now. I'm really impressed, since I've been covering this for years and years, and the last 7-8 years I've felt sunk in this new Cold War, this galloping new tensions and the kinds of lack of communication and misunderstanding that didn't even exist during the real Cold War that I grew up in. It's really bad. And finally, people on both sides, but especially in the West, where they got this hysteria pretty bad, they're starting to wake up and look at it with fresh eyes and see that there is a lot to the Russian position. There's a lot of logic to it. It's not ideological. It's about Russia's national interests, its security, basic things like not having its neighbors members of a hostile military alliance, which the United States never would tolerate. These kind of things need to be discussed, and it'll take a long time to grope toward compromises that will create satisfaction. It's very early days in this process, but there are a lot of reasons to hope that it will progress and reach some kind of better situation in 2022.
Okay, we'll see. I wish we had more time. Thank you very much, Fred Weir, journalist and political commentator from Moscow. Mike Billington, many thanks for your contribution.
One more thing,
Executive.
Let me just mention that behind all of this is the severe breakdown crisis in the Western financial system and the danger of a severe hyperinflation. You have to recognize that the West is facing a multiple series of crises over Russia and China, over the economy, over the pandemic, and this throws some sense that there will be sane actions into a bit of a skewed position. So we have to be very cautious about the need to take measures to deal with the collapse of the Western financial system if we're going to deal with the strategic crisis.
So are you talking about the fact that China might get involved with Russia regarding this? Is that what you mean? Because obviously that is how it could put a dent on the U.S. economy as a whole.
If the U.S. were to do what they're threatening and throw Russia off of SWIFT and so forth, it would destroy the U.S. and the European economies. And because it's already in a near breakdown crisis because of the printing of literally trillions of dollars over these past years, not for the real economy, but to bail out financial institutions and derivative bubbles.
Right.
We're therefore sitting on the brink of a general breakdown crisis of what is known as the world financial system, although, as we know, Russia and China are able to run their economies and their relations with most of the rest of the world independent of the dollar if they are forced to do so.
Sure.
So we must resolve this breakdown crisis in the West. We can't put that aside if we're going to succeed in solving the strategic crisis.
Thank you very much for that. Mike Billington from the Executive Intelligence Review from Leesburg, Virginia. And with that, we come to an end for this news review. Thanks for tuning in.